It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you receive expert fantasy advice for champions. With your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. Hello, NFL football fans and fantasy football owners. Welcome to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. As always, I'm your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. I've got a special and exciting show lined up for you today. We are just weeks away from the 2026 NFL football draft. We are still months away from the start of the 2026 NFL and fantasy football season. But in the off season, there was a ton of movement in free agency. And today we're going to talk about those free agent moves and take a look at what fantasy football owners should expect and what players I expect to have the biggest impact once the season comes around. Just in case you don't know where to follow me, make sure to give me a follow over on Twitter at NFL Exporter, Facebook.com/NFL Exporter, and on Instagram, the handle is at UFC ATL, which stands for Ultimate Football Club ATL. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And first, take a look at the quarterbacks that are in new places coming up for the upcoming season. We're going to go ahead and get things started with Malik Willis of the Miami Dolphins, was with the Green Bay Packers last year. I think when you look at the prospects for Malik Willis this year, wide receivers are not the same as they have been the last couple years. There is no more Tyreek Hill. There is no more Jalen Waddle. So to me, that ultimately is going to put some type of cap or limit on what he can overall produce. And it'll be real interesting to see how the Dolphins go about addressing that particular area, because we know for a quarterback, ultimately his wide receivers, which are his passing targets, along with his tight ends and running backs out of the backfield, but for the majority, his wide receivers are the way that he gets it done. When you look at the quarterbacks across the NFL, usually the quarterbacks who have the best and most effective wide receivers are the most successful. And when you take away Tyreek Hill, who was a perennial Pro Bowler prior to his ACL injury, which ended last season, when you look at Jalen Waddle, who have been one of the top 20 NFL and fantasy football receivers in the past couple years, this presents a huge challenge for Malik Willis. And ultimately for me, is a guy that I'm going to be kind of pumping the brakes on until I see what that Dolphins receiving core looks like. Let's now go ahead and move over to Geno Smith, back with the New York Jets, spent last season in Las Vegas, had some success, although it was short-term with the Seattle Seahawks. I think when you look at Geno Smith, we know that this is not a long-term move. Smith is on the tail end of his career, but he does have a wide receiver in Garrett Wilson, who is a #1 wide receiver. We are expecting for the New York Jets to draft a wide receiver, and this year there is a bevy of talent in that particular area. So we'll see how things work out for Geno Smith, but he's another guy where I don't have tons of expectations for, at least coming out of the gate. Next, let's move over to Justin Fields. Last year with the New York Jets, this year with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I think if you look at what he's got around him, not only in terms of talent, we know Rashee Rice has certainly shown that he can be a #1 wide receiver, although we know it was a top-tier quarterback like Patrick Mahomes that was making that happen. Travis Kelce is expected back this year, but we know he's on the tail end of his career. The other group of receivers in Kansas City are question marks up to a certain degree. I think the big thing, though, when you talk about having a head coach like Andy Reid, an offensive coordinator like Eric Bieniemy, could this be the right situation for Justin Fields to finally be able to show some consistency? I think he will be a guy that fantasy football owners will have their eyes on, at least to start the season. Let's move over to Kirk Cousins. Spent last year with the Atlanta Falcons. He's now going to be with the Las Vegas Raiders, another team that does not have a ton of talent and proven established playmakers at the wide receiver position. So that automatically creates challenges. We know that Kirk Cousins, like the aforementioned Geno Smith, not that mobile of a quarterback when we talk about making plays outside of the pocket and extending plays. You also have to factor in the Raiders are expected to take Fernando Mendoza out of the University of Indiana with the first overall pick in this year's draft. So Kirk Cousins could be in early play, probably not going to have a lot of appeal, more than likely will not finish the season as the starter. We move over to Tua Tagovailoa of the now Atlanta Falcons. We know he spent the first stint of his career with the Miami Dolphins, had a flash, or I should say, had a strong year, had a lot of good games, but also, and where we're at with Tua Tagovailoa right now, is a guy that owners do not trust. Too many turnovers, another quarterback, not mobile, not making plays outside of the pocket. He's going to be competing with Michael Penix Jr. for the starting spot with the Atlanta Falcons. I think when you look at the talent that the Falcons have with their playmakers, when you talk about running back Bijan Robinson, wide receiver Drake London, tight end Kyle Pitts, I think out of all the quarterbacks that we've discussed so far, he's probably got the most talent around him to work with, if he can make it work himself. The guy who's going to stand out head and shoulders above the rest of these quarterbacks, and we see as being a guy who's going to have the most fantasy football allure, and that is going to be Kyler Murray. Last year, or spent the first part of his career with the Arizona Cardinals, now moving over to the Minnesota Vikings. And when you have a number one receiver like a Justin Jefferson, you have a nice complimentary wide receiver in Jordan Addison, you have a good offensive coordinator and structure around, and out of all these quarterbacks we discussed, Kyler Murray is the one guy who most certainly has an ability to scramble, to make plays out of the pocket, to extend plays. And so he's the guy who is definitely going to have the attention of fantasy football owners coming into this year's draft, especially if the Vikings are able to add any more pieces in the passing game around him. All right, look, that is going to do it for our first segment. We are going to run to a quick commercial break. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football. Football fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. We're going to shift our attention now over to the running back position. We are taking a look at new faces and new places, breaking down what happened in the offseason, what free agents that fantasy football owners should be targeting early on, even though the NFL fantasy football season is a few months away. Let's get things started by talking about Rico Dowdle. Was with the Carolina Panthers last year, now with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's coming off a back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons rushing. When you talk about what he did in Dallas in 2024, with the Carolina Panthers in 2025, did not come into last season with Carolina expecting to be the starter. But once the starter in Chuba Hubbard did go down, Dowdle took full advantage of the opportunity. But by the time the season ended, he was in a timeshare, not happy about that. Let's see how the cards work out for him in Pittsburgh, where he is going to have to compete for that starting job with running back Jaylen Warren, who was there last year. I'm pretty sure Dowdle feels if he's given a fair shake, he's got an opportunity to earn that starting position. Or if the Steelers are going to handle their backfield like they did last year, which was a committee situation, maybe Dowdle feels he can have a heavy and high impact there. Now let's move on to a name that certainly had a lot of buzz and splash when you talked about this move in free agency. And this was actually David Montgomery coming over to the Houston Texans. And this was actually a trade. So this was not a free agent pickup, but nonetheless, this is the focus of our segment. And when you look at David Montgomery, certainly a guy who was not happy about his role reduction in Detroit last year. There was a new offensive coordinator. Ultimately, Jahmyr Gibbs took over the brunt of the workload. Montgomery still had some effective games and still has some tread left in the tire. This was a move, though, that had a bad offset for owners of Woody Marks, the now second-year running back for the Houston Texans. If you had Woody Marks in your dynasty or franchise league, you were expecting for him to get the full workload this year for Houston, and the way he looked in his rookie season, that would have boded well for him. Now with the veteran David Montgomery coming over from Detroit, without a shadow of a doubt, there is going to be some type of committee or timeshare. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. Let's move over to Rachaad White. Spent the first part of his career with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, now coming over to the Washington Commanders. There is certainly a role for him to carve out in this offense. Second-year running back Jacory Krosky-Merritt, probably expected to be the starter, but White should make a nice change of pace back. And with veteran Austin Ekeler no longer with the team, White could take over as the team's pass-catching running back as well. So he's a guy who certainly could have some value. Let's move over to Isaiah Pacheco of the former Kansas City Chiefs, now with the Detroit Lions. So he's the guy essentially who's going to be taking the place of David Montgomery in Detroit. We know that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be the unquestioned workhorse now, and for rightful reasons. One of the premier running backs, all-purpose running backs in the NFL. So I don't think that Pacheco has a ton of value to start the season, but probably will get some carries to spell Jahmyr Gibbs. And if Gibbs were to get hurt, then obviously Pacheco, if he is the backup running back, will see a huge boost in his fantasy value. Now let's move over to Kenneth Gainwell, a guy who had a strong season last year for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now he's with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers offense and running back situation really up in the air coming into the season. We know that Bucky Irvin was the starter last year, expected to have a huge season after what he did as a rookie. Unfortunately, injuries slowed him down. And by the time that the end of the season came around, there was a carousel going on at the running back position between Bucky Irvin, sharing time with Rachaad White, and also Sean Tucker. So you had three different guys all getting in there where the workload was split up. It became a huge headache for fantasy football owners. I'm not sure how Gainwell is going to fit into the equation this year, because I would assume that Bucky Irvin is expected to be the starter. You still have Sean Tucker there. This will be interesting to see how this works out. Let's move on to Brian Robinson Jr. Spent last season with the San Francisco 49ers, backing up all-pro running back Christian McCaffrey. Well, guess what? He's coming over to the Atlanta Falcons, where you have another all-pro caliber running back in Bijan Robinson. So with you're expecting for Brian Robinson to again come in, be a change of pace running back, and spell Bijan Robinson as needed. The guy that he's going to be replacing is Tyler Algier, who is now signed with the Arizona Cardinals. And I think if you look at that Arizona offense, there is certainly an opportunity for Algier to come in and make some noise. We know that James Conner is coming off a bad ankle injury. He's getting up in age and is a veteran. There's really no other running back in Arizona who's really stamped their place as being the official starter. Depending on which direction Arizona decides to go in the draft, don't be surprised to see Tyler Algier be a guy who has some fantasy football value coming into the upcoming season. The move that by far had the biggest splash and impact is going to be running back Travis Etienne coming from the Jacksonville Jaguars now over to the New Orleans Saints. This is a move that is great for Etienne as well as that Saints offense. They were in desperate need of a running back in New Orleans now that Alvin Kamara has pretty much checked out there. Very shocking move. Etienne was up over 1,000 rushing yards for the second time in 3 years over in Jacksonville. Had really been a staple of that offense, but the Jaguars decided to move on from him. And so I like Travis Etienne. You figure that if he can get the full workload for that New Orleans Saints offense, he is a guy who fantasy football owners are most definitely going to want to keep their eyes on. If the Saints can improve their offensive line, get some better playmakers on the outside at wide receiver next to Chris Olave, I like this move a lot. And Travis Etienne is a guy who we know has been a steady and consistent performer. All right, that is going to wrap up our segment. We're going to run to another quick commercial break. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. football fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. Let's go ahead now and shift our attention over to the wide receiver and tight end position. I think when we looked at quarterbacks and running backs, this wide receiver and tight end group is the group that I have the most impact players when we talk about free agents, guys who are in new places, new faces from what we've seen at the end of last year. Let's go ahead and take a look at those guys. We're going to get things started with DJ Moore. Now with the Buffalo Bills, was with the Chicago Bears the last couple seasons. When you look at DJ Moore, still has some good tread left in that tire. I think it'll be interesting to see exactly how Buffalo uses him. And you guys know, when we usually talk about wide receivers going over and bolstering teams' offenses, which is certainly something that DJ Moore is going to do, it is usually to the most benefit of that quarterback. So when you look at Josh Allen now, has Khalil Shakur, you're adding DJ Moore, Dawson Knox, and Dalton Kincaid at tight end. If they can get more usage out of third-year wide receiver Keon Coleman. But when you look at DJ Moore in itself as a whole, I'm not 100% sure he's going to come over to Buffalo and be a dominant number one wide receiver. If that's the plan, that remains to be seen. If he's going to be a 90-catch, 1,200-yard, 8 to 10 TD type guy, or is he going to just be a really trustworthy PPR guy that you have in your lineup? But again, when you look at the quarterback that he has, when you look at the pieces of that Buffalo Bills offense as a whole, especially with a running back like James Cook, who led the NFL in rushing yards last year, this is a big bonus for quarterback Josh Allen. That is without a shadow of a doubt. All right, now let's move over to Romeo Doubs, was with the Green Bay Packers, now with the New England Patriots. We know that the Patriots have moved on from wide receiver Stephon Diggs. When you look at that New England offense as a whole, Drake May really did not have a receiver outside of Stephon Diggs that he relied on every single week. And even within the confines of that, there were weeks where you could not find Stephon Diggs on the stat sheet for meaningful games for fantasy football. So I think Romeo Doubs is a guy who's probably just going to end up being one of many receiving targets in Drake May, quarterback for the Patriots. Doesn't necessarily dedicate himself to one guy. He's a quarterback who spreads the wealth around. We'll see how much of an impact Romeo Doubs potentially could have. All right, let's get into Michael Pittman Jr. I love this move for the Pittsburgh Steelers offense as a whole and for whatever quarterback is going to be there this year. Last year, Pittman Jr. was with the Indianapolis Colts. That's where he started his career. Now teaming up with DK Metcalf, and those two guys are going to be a handful for defenses to account for. So whether it's Aaron Rodgers coming back this year or there is another quarterback, having Michael Pittman Jr. along with DK Metcalf, those two guys are expected to dominate the targets at the wide receiver position. And as long as Pittman Jr. is getting his targets, I expect for him to be effective in Pittsburgh. Let's go ahead and now talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. Spent last year with the New York Giants, now with the Tennessee Titans. When you look at second-year quarterback Cam Ward, desperate for some good options in that passing game. Wan'Dale Robinson had a career year last year for the New York Giants. Is a guy who really excels in the slot. It'll be interesting to see what Tennessee does in the draft to address what is right now a mediocre to below average group of wide receivers. But Robinson is expected to come over and help. He's a guy we may want to keep our eyes on in terms of PPR value. Let's move over to a big splash move. When you talk about Jalen Waddle, coming over from the Miami Dolphins, now with the Denver Broncos. Another guy, like I just talked about with Michael Pittman, loving what he's doing for that Pittsburgh offense now, teaming up with DK Metcalf. Same thing here. I love Jalen Waddle coming over from Miami, teaming up with Courtland Sutton and some other more complementary pieces for that Denver Broncos offense. Again, your main beneficiary here is going to be quarterback Bo Nix. This gives his fantasy value a nice boost in stock, but I like Jalen Waddle. I think him and Courtland Sutton are going to make a nice duo. Again, we'll see exactly how that target share is spread out. But again, like Pittman Jr. and Metcalf in Pittsburgh, I'd expect for Courtland Sutton and Jalen Waddle to dominate the majority of the targets over for the Denver Broncos. Let's go over now to Jalen Nailor coming over from the Minnesota Vikings. Now with the Las Vegas Raiders, not a big name, not a big splash, but the Raiders offense is desperate for playmakers in the passing game. We'll see if Naylor was picked up for a specific reason or is just going to be more of a complementary role, which is what he was in Minnesota. But obviously, when you have receivers like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison above him, that's exactly what you'd expect. The biggest move in free agency coming this offseason is going to be veteran Mike Evans, who spent his entire, what is now going to be a future Hall of Fame career with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, now joining the San Francisco 49ers. And from a fit standpoint, from what the 49ers offense need to do, and ultimately some needs they really could address, you love Mike Evans coming over to San Francisco, a guy who should be able to fit in immediately with the cast of 49ers receivers. And again, the main beneficiary of that is going to be quarterback Brock Purdy. When he drops back to pass, he is going to have a lot of good and high and wide receivers to get the football to. We're going to round this thing out with two tight ends on the move. We're going to start with Chig Okonkwo, former Tennessee Titans, now with the Washington Commanders. Coming over there with a quarterback like Jaden Daniels, I most certainly think this is an opportunity for him with veteran Zach Ertz kind of on the outs. There's not really too many other tight ends on the roster who may be bolstering for that starting spot. So if they sign him for a reason, I think very low key under the radar, this could be a guy who could be a quality backup and someone that you will want to grab later in your drafts. The guy who caught our attention the most is going to be Isaiah Likely, coming over from the Baltimore Ravens, now with the New York Giants. We know that Likely, one of the better young, talented tight ends in the NFL, not particularly happy with having to share his role with veteran Mark Andrews over in Baltimore. Now coming over to the New York Giants. I think when you look at that Giants offense with second-year quarterback Jackson Dart, third-year receiver Malik Neighbors, second-year running back Cam Scatterbull, that is an offense that is set up for success. And if Isaiah Likely is a guy who's going to be utilized and focused on, you can expect for him to be a big impact player and potentially a top 10 fantasy ranked tight end coming into the season. All right, that is going to wrap up our show for today. I appreciate everybody for joining me. After this show, you should have the juices flowing, some excitement running through your veins. Again, I know the fantasy football season is some months off, but after hearing this show, you're probably going to want to do a mock draft. Again, if you don't know where to follow me on social media, make sure to give me a follow on Instagram. The handle there is at UFCATL, which stands for Ultimate Football Club ATL. On Twitter, at NFL Exporter, and Facebook.com/NFL Exporter. All right, that is going to do it for today's show. I appreciate you guys. I will see you soon. Make sure to leave some comments and hit me up on social media. It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. Let's go.